my assessment, and I'll like you to sort of respond to it, tell me if you agree or disagree and what your assessment is. So you have the woke, the sort of illiberal left, the diversity, inclusion, equity left has largely taken over the political left. They have the momentum, they have the energy, they even have a lot of the power. I think even this sort of Chappelle Netflix episode illustrates that, where Netflix is now apologizing. Um, so first of all, I want your sort of assessment of that. What do you think has happened to traditional liberalism, traditional liberal institutions in this country? How are they being undermined by this sort of diversity, equity, inclusion branch? And maybe we can, like we said, like use the ACLU as an example, because they really are an archetype of this phenomenon, I think.
Well, it seems to me that liberalism, as you've defined it, in terms of individual rights and due process, freedom of speech and expression, in many of these places is being overtaken or overwhelmed almost by a form of Marxism. But it's not a class-based Marxism, it's a Marxism of identity. And so the woke left has replaced sort of the class struggle, which I think actually, I'm not a Marxist, but we can talk about this later. I do think that the Marxist analysis, or at least the appreciation for materialist understanding of a society, has a lot more going for it than the identitarian one, which is what this sort of new Marxist identitarianism has now taken over, where we now have sort of an identity struggle, and it's groups sort of warring against each other. And so whereas the left in this country, and certainly I'm saying the 20th century, really, I mean, the left was founded, if you think of, what is the left when we think about the left? It's about class. That's what it was about class, and it was for the 20th century in Western countries, left-wing parties, whether it was Social Democrats in Europe or the Labour Party or the Democratic Party, it was largely based on class, the working class. And it was multiracial in that sense.
Right.
And now we're in a new era when there is less and less appreciation for class as a determining factor in life and in society, and it's been replaced by identity. And so the new proletariat, you could say, is sort of the non-white population, at least in this interpretation.
So Oprah would almost be in the proletariat class.
By this definition, yes.
Yeah.
Your class does not matter. And that also, I think, explains the disdain that you hear from so many of these pseudo leftists. I think they're actually portraying left-wing ideals. And this is why you hear them express such contempt for poor white people, who they should be trying to make appeals to based on their own economic ideology. And they could actually build a winning coalition, by the way, if they did. I do think that there is a large, and I know you're more libertarian, but if there was a political party in this country, or if the Democrats just sort of dispense with all the woke identity stuff and ran on a purely sort of economic populist nationalist platform, I think they'd be a winning party for the next couple of decades. There's a clear majority for that. But they've been taken over by this sort of cultural elite that's bred in the universities, elite media, the nonprofit world, entertainment, which is actually a small portion of the population, but they have almost a monopoly on cultural power. And one of this sort of weird things, and this actually take it back to Glenn Greenwald, funnily enough, but over the past 2 years or so, since this cultural revolution began, I found myself appreciating and reading writers on the left who I never really had much time for before. People like Glenn Greenwald, who I still disagree with fervently. You can't see it, but one of the pictures in the frame behind me is the cover story I wrote for Commentary magazine in 2013, after the Snowden revelations, in which Mr. Greenwald played a crucial role. That cover story I wrote for Commentary, attacking Greenwald and another far left journalist. So, I'm just prefacing what I'm about to say, which is that I've actually come to appreciate writers like Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, a guy named Freddie DeBoer. I don't know if you're familiar with him, who's a socialist, also on Substack. John Judas, who was a colleague of mine years ago at the New Republic magazine, who's also a socialist. A lot of these sort of old school socialist or social democrat writers, they have a more class-based understanding of society. And I might not agree with their prescriptions. I might not support socialist economic policies, but I do agree with them that your class is a much greater determinant of how you will fare in American society than any other factor. Your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. If you are born poor in this country, you will have a much more difficult life than if you are born middle class or working class. And I think that's indisputable, but you can't really make those arguments in a lot of these elite institutions. And, I think one of the best critiques of the 1619 Project I read on the World Socialist Workers website, because they were basically arguing this 1619 Project and all that goes with it is basically a kind of neoliberal attempt to distract the workers from their class interest. It's dividing everyone by race when we should be appealing to everyone by class.
Yeah, I would just like to interject real quick with the 1619 bit, because it's very interesting you mention that. So that was, it's been reported, so right after the sort of Trump-Russia collusion stuff narrative wasn't going to fly anymore after the Mueller report, they deliberately went to focusing on race, and they came up with the 1619 Project to sort of center the new narrative around.
I mean, I think the 1619 Project was in development for a long time before that, but yes, there was this, and I've written about this, there was this sort of, internal meeting at the New York Times where the editor basically said what you said, that the Russiagate story had sort of run its course, and now the next, narrative we're going to focus on is race in America. And he was attacked, I think, by some of his own reporters who were saying we're not doing enough on race, that everything is about race. Every science story, every art story should be about race. So I think this is a large part of it. And, I don't really consider myself a man of the left. So I'm kind of a centrist. And I'm not really of any kind of political persuasion. But if you're watching what's going on at the left right now, I think it's very clear. And you see the people who are sort of outcasts on the left are those who, like Bernie Sanders, are trying or have tried to put the emphasis on class. I think Sanders has basically been neutered on this. He's basically come around to the woke viewpoint.
That's right.
And it's sort of interesting because this is a guy who's very stubborn and has spent, whatever you want to say about him, he's, he kind of sticks to his script, and he'd been doing that for decades. And by the way, not to the exclusion of racial issues. I mean, this was a guy who was arrested in civil rights protests in the 1960s. The notion that he is, in any way a racist is absurd.
Right.
And I think the argument that he would make, and I would actually agree with him on this, is that his policies, or at least the socialist policies, or the broad-based economic policies, maybe not even socialist, the broad-based economic policies will benefit the greater mass of people equally. And by the way, they will disproportionately benefit African Americans and people of color because they are disproportionately poorer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very strange way in which this debate has been framed, in which I think you have basically white progressives, upper middle class white progressives are the ones who have become extremely left-wing, more left-wing than non-white voters in this country.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the Democratic Party and you look at the breakdown, either a majority or certainly a disproportionate number of the conservative and moderate Democrats are non-white.
Right.
And the progressives in the Democratic Party are disproportionately, overwhelmingly the white Democrats.
Right. And what percentage of the African American community do you think is in favor of drag queen story hour for children? These are like these elite
African Americans in particular are socially conservative.
Right.
So we know that they are not on board with a lot of this agenda. They were not on board with gay marriage, 10 years ago, and that was a major issue. But again, those individuals don't have the voice in our media, in our culture. They don't have the tenured professorships. They don't have the columns at the major newspapers. You're starting to see new voices emerge, podcasts, Substack,
Right.
and whatnot. I mean, there's a very kind of it's a real sort of democratic moment in media now. It's a almost revolutionary moment, and we're seeing the kind of breakdown in authority, I think, which is a huge part of this, and that the institutions of authority in this country, from the universities to the CIA to the FBI to the foundations to the establishment media to the CDC. I mean, all these institutions have basically, Americans are losing trust in them, which I think is a very worrying trend. Not that I think that it's not deserved in many cases, but it's a worrying trend when the American people don't really trust anything anymore. That can make it easy for conspiracy theories to spread, and it's hard basically to have a cohesive society. But there is a silver lining to it, and I think in that we are seeing the growth of new voices in the media, and people are becoming more skeptical perhaps of what they hear. They're more open to alternative points of view.
So this is one of the things I always sort of joke about was I I almost have more respect for and I'm, as anti-communist as you can get, but at least I never even thought I would premise a sort of question with at least the communists. But they had, like you said, and the socialists as well. We can maybe focus on them a bit more, although those terms were traditionally used interchangeably. But they had a cohesive sort of multi-ethnic program where if you were born with certain immutable characteristics, like it didn't really matter as long as you sort of bought into the economic arguments. And I completely agree that if there were a traditional pro-labor, pro-working man party that sort of appealed to your, GM worker and your electricians and plumbers and this and that, or people who are in the working class, who are whites or of multiple races, that would be a very much winning coalition.
I mean,